Hi there guys, it's Brenda from Stellar Evolution Design. So I'm going to take you through the leggings pattern I made for my Momonita ball jointed doll. Just received her recently and thought I would do up a custom fit ball jointed doll legging for her. And yeah, so I made a little pattern. Hopefully I can share that with you guys as well. I like my leggings to fit really well, especially around the rear region of the doll. I've put some poses there, of course, so you can see when you get the pattern. And let's get started. So there are a left and right side of the pattern, although they are both the same. And to start cutting out your pattern, there is a list of materials when you first get to the first page. Some helpful tips as well. So when I made this pattern, I hope I can explain it to those who are beginners, as well as give some tips to those who may have been sewing for a while. So I've cut out one leg of my pattern. Here I've got my stretchy knit fabric, and there is a little key here on the pattern that does say the stretchiest part should go in that direction. So with my fabric, to test that, you will pull your fabric and it should have stretch, and the best is to have stretch that goes both ways. Now it's a little less stretchy this direction, so I will lay it so it has the most stretch in this direction, and that helps get it on your doll's hips and rear end, which Momonita has a ample rear end, which is great and super cute. So you can either lay your left and right patterns face up on the pattern, or to do marking if you want with your tools, best to lay it face down and then put your pattern on and trace. I like to save time, and like I said, since both legs are exactly the same, I would lay my fabric right sides together and then take my pattern piece this way because we have more fabric, and cut both at the same time. So I have left both tips or ways of doing that in the pattern piece for when you're cutting. I like to use a rotary blade as well. It's quicker most of the time, and I can just kind of slice through it and around my pattern piece. So one of my preferred ways of cutting fabric these days. I would love to get a smaller one with a smaller wheel, especially for the miniature cutting that we get to do. And then just ordering blades online is usually what I do to replenish them. This one I know I should be replacing the blade soon to give me the sharpest cut. You will see the seam allowances marked, so where it says 1/4 inch SA, there's also a millimeter mark. For those of us who are out in Canada here, or rest of the world, that like to use the metric system, though I still generally have a 1/4 inch foot from quilting, so a lot of background of sewing comes in quilting form as well. So there we go. Pretty simple cut to get our pieces. And the front and back will be a little different, so you can always lay it against your pattern piece and figure out which is front and back. So next we will want to do our stitching down the center of the leg, and I'll meet you over at the ironing board. So now we're at the ironing board, and we want to just create a little crease where our dotted line is through this middle of our pants, and this will just help us follow in making those details down the side of the pants. I like to use a contrasting thread for that detail. You can use kind of that mustard yellow that you would see in denim. You could also use a white. I have a pink that kind of matches the Momonita pink on my online store. I use a steam or kind of the low number 4 setting on my iron. Of course, you'd want to use whatever fits your fabric setting, and again just folding them in half and getting into the center of that leg And this just helps us again. If you had, say, a chalk line that you wanted to follow, if you need something a little more visual to help you, that is good too. You can use no thread if you didn't want to stitch through. This way we start and give ourselves a little something to watch. So now we'll take it over to the sewing machine. Okay, so we're over here at the sewing machine. I have a Husqvarna Viking opal machine. Now you don't have to have the fanciest machine. I've used thrift store machines for a majority of my sewing career, and as long as you learn how to take care of them, they can treat you just right, and you can sew a heck of a lot of things on them, provided you do use things like the correct threads and the correct needles. So for this job, we do want to use a jersey needle, something meant for sewing knits. So it will have a rounded needle tip. They are also sometimes called stretch needles or ballpoint needles, and this helps keep it from kind of piercing your fabric or wrecking the elastic in it, like a sharp needle would or a universal needle. So it really does help to use the correct needle. I have a size 80 in there right now for this project. Now we are going to use a straight stitch, so not a zigzag and not a stretch stitch for this detail stitching. If you have a machine that can do fancy stitches, you are welcome to use them in this line of stitching. I recommend testing it first on a scrap piece. That always will save some amazing things in your sewing career, is to test it out first. So I've got my straight stitch set. I'm using a piece of tissue paper to start this all off, and that will keep your knit from getting pulled down into your sewing machine. So it's a great trick to use as well with fabrics that can be a little more delicate or a little more difficult, especially true in sewing small seams for doll stitching too. So we're just going to get started here. Stitch straight down with our contrasting thread. I picked yellow. I'm going to slow down near the end and use some of my quilting knowledge to open up and do our second piece as well. So when you try and piece quickly and do multiple things at once, we're just going to put our second line right in there, and we can snip them apart once we get them out of the machine. So yeah, putting them together, doing things in a timely fashion is always helpful. You might hear my dogs barking in the background. Okay, so we've got those two pieces. We'll come back to the ironing board now. Now that we've stitched our detail stitch down the side, it does look kind of wrinkly and crinkly. And we still have this tissue paper. Now the tissue paper can easily be removed. That's why we use it. Very simple. And we didn't really fix our two ends here, but what we want to do is, I prefer to iron the wrong side of fabric. Again, always protecting the integrity of your good side of your fabric. We have our warm iron. We're just going to give a little press to help smooth everything down, flatten the seam, and then we notice that the next step is to kind of iron the hem on the pant and the waistband down 1/4 inch. So, trick for getting really nice kind of flat seams is to use a bit of a guide, and you can use the pattern piece for that. So just folding up the bottom hem of your pant over top of the pattern piece and giving it a press. So now you've got your 1/4 inch there. At the top of your pattern piece, folding down that 1/4 inch. Of course, watch your fingers with the iron. I usually use little silicone finger caps when ironing. They're much nicer to use. You won't burn your fingers. So now we've got both of those sides done. And the next stage is to bring them back to the sewing machine and to stitch our foot cuffs down back to the sewing machine. Got our pant cuffs in under the foot. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. So you could either use a stretch stitch if your machine does them, or a zigzag stitch. This will allow you to have stretch when your doll's foot goes through the pant leg. We also want to pull a little bit so that the stitch will get stretched. So we have more stitches kind of per stitch length here. So you'll see me do that as we stitch through. So again, I'm just going to hold, let my machine stretch a little bit as it feeds through. And because I like doing two things at once, again, kind of chain piecing these together. And let it stretch. This will give some elasticity to their foot. And then you can double check. And again, this would be something to test maybe with a scrap before you start sewing if you want to make sure everything's going to turn out okay. It's always good to do a little torture test. So now we have the feet cuffs sewn down, and that's the purpose of doing this part, so that you can have a nice neat cuff at the bottom. So here's the front of our pants. If we had a hard time telling, you can always refer back to your pattern piece, lay it on top, and see which side is the front and back, so they are labeled as well. We're going to be using the 1/4 inch seam allowance, or 6 millimeters, on here, and we will be doing a trim about 1/8 of an inch after we sew, and that's so we can get less bulk in kind of the crotch area afterwards. It's really hard to sew down right to these points, so we're going to try and make our life a little easier, especially when we sew miniatures. Now, the one thing we will do as well to have a really kind of flat seam at the front is we're going to fold up where we've bent over our waistband or ironed our waistband, and we will sew both of those ends together as well. So I've just used some pins to hold it in place as we're kind of going to put it under the machine. So because my hand was totally in the way for sewing the front part of the pants, I'm just giving you a little look here where I would have sewed after I had cut off the portion. So just sew down the front following the curve, and I would have done a 1/4 of an inch seam there. We will do the same on the back, so you'll be able to see that. Don't you love real life video stuff? So yeah, we will do that and then move on to our waistband. So now we're sewing the waistband down. I've put a couple pins in, and similar to how we did the feet, we are going to stretch this as we sew. So we'll get it started here, letting the machine do some of the work, and then just a little pause and a little hold, and removing some of the needles to let the machine do the stretch stitch. And then just being careful as it goes over that little middle lump of fabric that joined the two fabrics together. And again, just holding a bit and letting it stretch out. There, so you got a little side view when we did the foot and a little above view. So hopefully that helped see how it got stretchy. Again, we can give our waistband here a little stretch just to make sure. And it did pin down our seams here. I will go and trim this little bit off because it will annoy me. But it does nail down our decorative stitch as well. So the back of our pants are pinned. We're going to do same as the front, a 1/4 inch seam. Starting at the top, we will back stitch and come our way down. We want the back stitching to be fairly substantial, as this seam and part of the pants will take some wear and tear. So we're putting in to our machine. And I like to put a little further in because I know I'm going to back stitch. I don't have to start right at the edge. That'll help, again, keep your fabric above board, above the stitch plate. A couple back stitches there. Doing my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And taking my pins out as we go. So now we will want to open the pants up, since they have a front and a back, and we know where those are. And we will be matching the 2 seams together, and that will make the crotch part of our pants. And the only thing to kind of be wary of or to note is which way the front seam will sit. So the direction with which we sewed it into our waistband, we'd like that to lay flat. So we do want to make sure that seam will lay the same direction when we join it to the bottom seam. So we want to make sure that is going to be pointing that direction as it is in the top one. And we will join these 2 seams together and kind of cuddle them next to each other, but not overlapping. And so you can start pinning there and get down to the about halfway down, and then I like to pin the foot together, the bottom part of the pant together, and then kind of finalize that pinning, just so you can kind of wiggle it all together and make sure every seam matches. So I'm going to do that. You can do that too, and then I'll come back and we'll sew the leg seams for our pants, the tubes together. All right, how many times did you stab yourself? Pins are never my favorite. They're so pokey. So we've got everything pinned down from the center of our pants down to the little legs, and I like to start at the crotch area. It gives you a little more stability in your fabric, and then sew down to the foot, and we're going to back stitch at both those areas. It's much easier to start in the middle. It gives a little better shape, I find, but personal preference. You can try either. If you're going to make a few pairs of these, welcome to give that a go. We are going to use 1/8 of an inch because we want our pants to be kind of nice and tight. You want to make sure you're watching that on your seam and on your foot, and making sure not to super sew over our pins. So again, this is an area where you be careful with pin management. I'm going to slide that guy out of there. Try to zoom in a little bit so that you can see what we have going on down there. And if you don't have a foot that has like these specific markings, this is much more like a quilting foot, but works really well. You could always use nail polish to do a mark on your foot. And you can use painter's tape on your sewing machine if you want, to make specific marks for a project. I've done that as well. So now we get to the foot cuff. I just lifted my foot so that it would make sure to get everything underneath, because I'm going to do some back stitching here. One leg down. So I do flip my pants over. Do a little check. Seems to have caught everything, but we'll do a final check of that when we're done here. So try to put it right back in the place where we started. Okay, so let's see if we can zoom out a little bit. So now we've got our line that goes all the way down. I would be a bit cautious about this piece here. Remember, we sewed it on this side. It looks great from this side. So always do a double check of all your seams before you flip it inside out. And that will save a lot of frustration, as I noted in the pattern. And I have done many times before where you get excited, so excited, and you flip something inside out and put it on your doll, and then, oh goodness, something needs a tweak or a little change. And the worst thing is to have to turn something so tiny inside out again. So even like this, you could put it on your doll, or like me, you can start testing it inside out, or using a thing like a chopstick or a knitting needle. Being cautious and careful though. So we don't have anything poking through. That looks pretty good. I'm not getting anything letting go or coming through. So it grabbed everything. So yeah, now when we want to turn our pants, again, gently sew with your finger, and then you can use that knitting needle gently to do a little bit of poking through. My most favorite needle came in a like Learn to Knit book, and has a nice little ball at the end, which is actually the preferred end to be turning something with. Because it's not going to actually come through your fabric. So that's the end I'd rather use to be able to turn this inside out. And then, of course, once you have everything where you want it to be, then it's ready to be put on your doll and start playing dress up for sure with the stylish leggings that you've just created. And they can get addictive because with all the different options you have, especially if you have a machine that does different decorative stitches, you can start putting those down the side of them and get carried away. Definitely. And using different colors of thread, or if you have a color changing thread that goes throughout, those could also be used. You could sew on other details like pockets, if you so cared, along the front part of the pants. But yeah, so there we go, turned inside out. And you've now been able to sew leggings. And this can go for any doll, so you can trace some outlines of your dolls or look online for kind of grading or making scale measurements. There are some good Pinterest boards and things for doing that for other size dolls. So there you go. Hopefully, if you watched this all the way to the end and said, I don't want to do that, I do make them and sell them for Momonita specifically, but also for other dolls like minifies, 1/3 scale and other 1/6 scale dolls on my website, which is stellarevolutiondesigns.com. You can find my dolly dedicated Instagram account, which is at Stellar BJD accessories. I also have an Instagram account for my designs, which is at Stellar Evolution Designs. And I'd be happy to see your makes and have any suggestions for other things that I should make patterns for, so or dolls in specifics. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed, learned some few tips, and leave any comments below, because I'd love to hear from you. Any suggestions? Thanks. Bye.